preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening. My name is Paul Radensky. I'm the Assistant Director of the 92nd Street Y's Bronfman Center for Jewish Life. I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's program, which is entitled Why Be Jewish? And promises to be a stimulating evening. Before I introduce our speakers, I would like to bring to your attention a couple of our programs. The first is Derech Torah, a 30-week introduction to Judaism class. This is a wonderful, non-judgmental program for singles and couples who do not have much Jewish education but would like to make Judaism an important part of their lives. Also, I would like to take this opportunity to point out that our final Jewish Adult Seminar for the year will take place next week on Tuesday, June 6th at 7:30 p.m. The topic will be Preparing Your Jewish Marriage, and will provide a thoughtful introduction to this important subject. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speakers for tonight's program. Rabbi Julie Schonfeld is the spiritual leader of the Society for the Advancement of Judaism, where she has played a key role in reviving that historic congregation. Prior to beginning her rabbinic training, she wrote several original plays and adaptations and worked with Joseph Papp's New York Shakespeare Festival, teaching playwriting in New York City public schools. While completing her rabbinic training, Rabbi Schonfeld toured with her original one-woman show, my apologies, Redemption and the Perfect Dress. So you're a female rabbi, what's that like? Throughout the United States and Canada. Rabbi Schonfeld is the creator of Touchstones, an interdisciplinary program in which participants explore Judaism through their passions and interests. Now, Dr. Richard Hodes. Dr. Hodes has served as the medical director of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee in Ethiopia since 1980, where he participated in Operation Solomon, the massive airlift of May 1991 of over 14,000 Ethiopian Jews to Tel Aviv. In response to the crisis in Rwanda in the summer of 1994, Dr. Hodes headed up the joint medical team at the Kimbumba refugee camp in Zaire, where he set up a hospital and was responsible for saving thousands of lives. In February 1995, Dr. Hodes returned to Ethiopia to continue his efforts with the joint in assuring the well-being of the remaining Jewish population of Ethiopia. And now, please join me in welcoming Rabbi Schonfeld and Dr. Hodes. And now I'd like to just take a moment and give you a plan for the evening before I ask Rabbi Schonfeld and then Dr. Hodes to speak. First, Rabbi Schonfeld will speak, and then Dr. Hodes will speak. And then at approximately 8:20 or so, we'll have time for questions and answers. And from 8:35 to 8:45, we'll be going over a text that we've selected, which I think will illuminate some of the ideas that we've spoken about tonight. And then we'll conclude, so please stay for the entire program. I'd like to now call Rabbi Schonfeld to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to begin with a brief story, a story from the Hasidic tradition. And the story goes as follows. The rabbi of Berdichev saw a man running down the street, looking neither to the right nor to the left, but hurrying past everyone without taking notice. And the rabbi said to the man, "Where are you running to?" And the man said, "Well, I'm running after my livelihood. I have to find my work." And the rabbi said, "How do you know that your work is in front of you? Perhaps your work is behind you, and if you stopped running, you would find it." And I would like to suggest, as an opening tonight, that the project of being a Jew, pursuing a Jewish life, is our work. I'd like to go even one step farther and suggest that being a Jew is the most important thing that I will ever do with my life, and perhaps even to be so bold as to propose to you that you might consider the same conclusion, that being a Jew, living your life as a Jew, is the most important thing that you will ever do. And I want to be clear in this, that I do not mean this as a poetic notion, as a metaphoric notion. I mean it actually in quite a literal sense. I think that if we take a look at the grand nature of the Jewish tradition, which we have inherited, at the beauty of it, at the scope of it, at the breadth of what it teaches about justice, about human kindness, about living a decent life, if we look at the scope of that tradition, at the magnitude of the task that faces any generation to carry that on, and if we look at the rather limited number of people who are here to carry it on, even if every Jew in the world were dedicated to making living a Jewish life their core objective, even so, it would take every one of us, all of our lives, and all of our efforts to do this project a justice. And so it seems to me that for every person sitting in this room, it matters in a very real and concrete way whether or not you live your life as a Jew. And each and every action that you do, each and everything that you do in preparation for that goal matters, makes an impact. And I would like to take this notion, this proposition that I am making to you tonight about the ultimate importance of being a Jew, and break it down a little further. I want to take a look at what I mean when I say to be a Jew, because I am not using the terminology which was used in the heading for tonight's program. The title of the program is Why Be Jewish? But I want to suggest, at least for argument's sake, and you will forgive me if it seems only like a semantic difference, but I want to suggest for argument's sake that there is some concrete difference between thinking of oneself as Jewish and thinking of oneself as a Jew. And for purposes of this argument, I would like to suggest that many of us, when asked, what does it mean to you to be Jewish, right? What is your Jewish life about? We struggle with any one of a number of signifiers, of identity markers that we somehow feel identified with, right? It may be something as simple as holiday celebrations. It may be bagels and lox. It may be matzah at Passover. It may be giving a contribution to UJA or to another Jewish organization. It may be some sense that I am pursuing being a good person. It may be some association with Israel or with a child's bar or bat mitzvah or with some of the accomplishments of the Jewish civilization. To be Jewish, if you will, is to have some sort of association with those things that have been created by, accomplished by Jews, the byproducts of the lives of Jews. But I think that there is another way of approaching this question, that it is possible to conceive of the notion whereby myself, my whole self, my core self, is a Jew. And every day, at every juncture that I face, every question that I ask myself, whether it be a question regarding business dealings or whether it be a question about what I eat or whether it be a question even affecting things such as who I vote for or what causes I give my charity to, it is possible to conceive of a self whereby each of those questions is refracted through the light of what does Judaism teach about this, and what does it mean that I, who am a Jew, right, am taking this action. So the notion of being a Jew, therefore, is not something of being, but it is something, if you will, of becoming. Each day, we choose over and over and over again to be Jews, to do things the way that Judaism might influence us to do them. And it is by the aggregate of those choices that we are not yet, but are ever becoming Jews. What then is the sort of picture of what it means to be a Jew? What does this person look like? And I would like to quote for you the words of Abraham Joshua Heschel, who described the life of the Jew as follows. He said, "Who is a Jew? A person whose integrity decays when unmoved by the knowledge of wrong done to other people. A person in travail with God's dreams and designs. A person to whom God is a challenge, not an abstraction. A person involved in the sanctification of time, who cultivates a passion for justice and has the ability to experience the arrival of Friday night as an event. A person who knows how to keep alive what is holy in our people's past, and to cherish the promise and the vision of redemption in days to come." Now, for myself, I extrapolate from Heschel's words, I think they are great words, 3 central notions. One is this notion that he puts forth of sanctity, of the sacred, of really endeavoring to see in every moment, right, the fact that there is something transcendent in the person that I am with, in the work that I am viewing, in the effort that someone is making towards me, in the words that I am hearing, in the mere fact that we are here, that we are all sitting in our chairs, that we are alive, that we are learning, that we have, as the Shehechianu prayer says, that we have been brought to this day, to this moment. In that, with all of the sort of good or bad that this day has brought, in that is a miracle. In that is the miracle of the sacred. Secondly, there is this notion that Heschel puts forth of righteousness, if you will, of the notion that the Jew cannot just sit by while other people are suffering, and cannot sit by not only for suffering that is happening far off, but for suffering that is happening in the people with whom we are dealing at the moment, in the people in our family, the people who are our friends, the people who are our co-workers, that this awareness of the miracle of having been brought to this moment somehow awakens in me some desire to reach out beyond myself. And finally, this notion that Heschel puts forth of the we, right? That there is something of a communal aspect, that I do not exist in this bounded self that society suggests that I am, but that I am, by definition, someone who must share herself with you and who must allow you to share yourself with me. So those 3 elements that I suggest, the sacred, the righteous, and the community, are perhaps a very encapsulated definition of what it means to be a Jew. Well, now I come to the real question. The program tonight, I've been brought here to discuss a little bit and reflect a little bit on my past and my present, on the work that I did in the theater and how it brought me or didn't bring me to the work that I do now as a rabbi and to the Jewish life that I live now. But in truth, all of these pursuits, right, the desire to see the transcendent in every moment, the desire to give of myself to work for a better world, the desire, the hunger to live in community, all of these things were always a part of my aspirations. I don't mean to suggest that I fulfilled them or achieved them, but they were some part of an aspiration. And yet, I did not grow up as an observant person. I didn't grow up with a very strong sense of what it meant to be a Jew, except insofar as this is what I knew I was. So what then is the difference? What is the difference between grasping these ideas through the theater, through politics, through art, and grasping them through Judaism? And in order to address this question, I have to actually say that to talk about the theater would not be the best way that I could bring my experience to bear on the subject at hand. Because while I certainly pursued a great communal story through the theater, and certainly pursued some notion of connection to people, of being able to create something through human contact through the theater, and while I pursued some notion of the past being able to teach me wisdom and great writing and great art, while all of these things were true, what is much more true about what I bring to this evening is not the exceptional, but really rather the banal. The fact that I am very much a product of my generation, a third generation Jewish American, someone whose grandparents came to this country, whose parents were very heavily identified as Jews, but who did not practice an explicitly Jewish life. And I am the daughter of those parents who went ahead and had full access to life in America. We did not celebrate a Passover Seder. We did not go to temple on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Needless to say, I didn't know any Hebrew. I hadn't been to temple at all. I didn't practice the laws of kashrut. And yet I will tell you that that hunger to pursue Judaism was perhaps the strongest and most ever-present aspect of my life for as long as I can remember. I was very blessed in many ways to have been brought up only with a memory of a Jewish past. My grandfather was an Orthodox rabbi, and I grew up with a notion that that was a great thing. That happened to not be what we did, but that was objectively a great thing. And so, as with telling a child that there is something very, very valuable in the top drawer, but they can't go look at what it is, that was always the fascination and the obsession to find out what that was. And so from earliest childhood, I hoped to make more contact with Judaism, to follow friends of mine to Hebrew school, to see what other people were doing. I found the sacred and the transcendent in the theater. I had that first very visceral glimpse of the fact that there is something, some life force that is in us, right? That I felt in a room like this one where the lights went out and everybody was concentrating on one thing. And in that concentration, that sort of prayerful concentration, I had some sort of a hunch, some sort of an inkling of something that was godly, that was spiritual, that was transcendent. And for the rest of my youth and for my early adulthood, I pursued that wholeheartedly. I had the great pleasure of writing a number of plays and both performing them myself and watching them performed. I had the great honor of working with the New York Shakespeare Festival in a program called Playwriting in the Schools. And it was in playwriting in the schools that I discovered, right, what it means that Judaism is a civilization, as the founder of my synagogue, Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan, said. When I was working with playwriting in the schools, there were a group, a troupe, if you will, of actors and writers and directors who went to New York City public schools where the core of the ethnic population was not our own. And our job there, as we defined it, was to get kids to write plays about their experiences, to preserve cultural stories and to encourage cultural stories, and to use this notion of a shared story to strengthen a community. And so with Latino American playwrights and Black American playwrights and Asian American playwrights, I experienced what it meant for people to be, if you will, rabbis. To be committed to helping people find their shared common story. And also to using the theater in order to build community. And it was in that context of working with these very, very talented and very dedicated people that I became most painfully aware that I knew very little and could share very little and could certainly not lead at all in helping my own community with its own story. And though there are many, many details that the time is too short to include, it was with that recognition that the path of being in theater began to turn to focus more centrally on the Jewish path. For the 10 or more years leading up to that time, I had all the while been trying to sort of break into Judaism. And I mention that because I think it's worth mentioning, that it's actually quite difficult if one does not have a Jewish background, does not know Hebrew, does not know their way around the synagogue. It's hard to become a part of this thing that we have. And it is also quite hard because that immediate gratification, right, that sort of spiritual gratification can't be attained. It's not a quick fix. There's a long, long period of study and a long period of acquiring knowledge, at least for me, before I had enough knowledge and enough ability, right, to really begin to draw from these Jewish communities all of the religious and spiritual sustenance that I desired, as well as the social sustenance. And so these two projects had been going on for quite some time on parallel tracks. I was involved in the theater. I was involved always in community-oriented theater. And I was also involved bit by bit in pursuing Judaism. And as Judaism was a kind of a slow pursuit, I was also pursuing a number of other things. I was doing a lot of yoga and a lot of meditation, and I was reading a lot of books, and I was talking to a lot of people about their religious lives and their spiritual lives. And all of these things were happening at the same time until one day there actually was sort of an aha moment. I was standing online for a movie with a friend of mine who is a so-called Jubu, a Jewish Buddhist. She is the follower of a guru. And I was telling her about, the course that I was taking for 4 sessions at this place and the efforts that I was making at learning a little bit of Hebrew and the yoga that I was doing in the ashram that I had visited and the lecture that I had gone to. And she said, well, the guru says that you need fidelity to path. You cannot really get anywhere, she told me, unless you have a fidelity to the religious path which you are on. And as simple, right, as day is day, standing there outside the movie theater, it was clear to me that since my great hunger was to be Jewish, right, was to open up the prayer book and look at the Hebrew and have it be more than just squiggles on the page, was to go to synagogue and feel a real part of that community, not a stranger, not someone sitting at the back who wasn't quite sure what was going on. That it was my great driving desire, knowing that my grandfather had been a rabbi and that there were many people who had been very deeply religious Jews in my family, that it was my great desire to somehow know what that meant, whether or not I knew if I could do it, that therefore all of this other stuff was not a good use of my time, right? The best use of my time would be to have this fidelity to path. And I became very focused, not only on learning how to be a Jew, right, much of which, as I said, was just a lot of work. Just a lot of studying and knowledge acquisition and going to places where I didn't know anybody. That not only was I going to do that work, but I was going to somehow, right, take this experience that I had had sitting in a dark room like this and somehow viscerally knowing that there was some spark that was in all of us, right? That is a very powerful thing when we are all focused on the same moment. That I was going to take the satisfaction of that experience and I was going to bring it with me even when I didn't know what was going on. And that I would bring it with me over and over again until those two things started to come together. And I would like to go from that description to an answer to a question that I get asked very frequently, which relates to the kind of Judaism that I practice, the way I express my Jewish life. And that is to say, I don't practice my Jewish life by saying my family is Jewish and I know a lot about the Jewish theater, about the Yiddish theater, and I eat these particular foods, etc., etc. For me, the core of my Jewish life, the core of how I continue to pursue being a Jew, is about my observant life. It is about the experience that I have when Shabbat comes in, and whether I am finished with what I am doing or not finished with what I am doing, it becomes eminently clear to me that this is not on my schedule, that I am somehow on, if you will, God's schedule. Night has come and it's time to stop. And that if I get a call from someone in my community who needs me, right, whether they need me as the rabbi or whether they merely need me as a member of the community to make a minyan, to participate in some communal function, to help set up someone's house for a shiva, that I become aware that the world does not revolve, if you will, around my Filofax and my Rolodex, but there is some greater pursuit beyond me which I am involved in. And people ask me, right, regarding things like Shabbat observance, Kashrut observance, etc. Well, how observant do I have to be? And isn't it enough to just be a good person? Isn't the purpose of Judaism, after all, just to be good? And it is there ultimately that I think I bring the experience that I had in the theater. That I know that this is not an idea, but that this is a whole lived experience. And that I make each one of these decisions out of this core experience of feeling like I'm a Jew. And I wouldn't always feel it every day by my opinion necessarily, or by a thought that's in my head. But every single day, every single moment is filled with these actions, which are the actions of a Jew. To get up in the morning and pray, to eat certain foods and not others, etc., etc. And that it is in the context of this whole experience that I really begin, if you will, not just to play the role, but to become the role. And with this whole package, if I do my job right, I will be equipped to become the role. I will have done enough exercises to have the stamina to be on the stage, if you will, that long. I will have prepared the language well enough to understand what the lines mean. I will be sufficiently confident in what I'm doing so that when someone else I'm on stage with does something I don't expect them to do, that I am prepared to respond and to tolerate that moment and to go on to the next moment. If I really, do what I am supposed to do and accomplish my work, if you will, getting back to the Berdichev story that I mentioned a few minutes ago, then I will be strong enough and prepared enough to take this great thing, right? This incredible opus, which is Judaism, which is far, far greater than any piece of work that I will ever write or create by myself or unto myself. If I am really prepared, I will be able to take this opus and hold on to it long enough to show it to someone else, to some next generation of people, if you will, so that this thing which has gone so many generations before me will have some life after me. I will become some small link in the chain. And it is the possibility of taking all of these desires, all of these hungers for transcendence, for community, for pursuing what is good and what is right, and doing it not just any way I can find to do it in the world in which I live, but doing it as a Jew, which takes all of these endeavors and raises them and raises my experience of my life to a much different level. And I would like to read to you now, if I may, from the Liturgy for Ne'ilah. This is the liturgy of the closing service of Yom Kippur. Ma anu, what are we? Ma chayenu, what is our life? Me chastenu, what is our love? Ma tzidkenu, what is our righteousness? Ma yishenu, what is our help? Ma kochenu, What is our strength? Ma gvurotenu. What is our, again, strength? All of these questions refer back to one central core. It is the core of our tradition and the core of our striving toward the transcendent. And all of these questions relate back to Judaism's ultimate desire, that we develop an ability to discern between that which is regular and that which is holy, that which is just and that which is unjust. Ultimately, to discern for our lives what is the difference between that which is worthwhile and that which is trivial. And it is Judaism's ultimate desire that each of us put our effort, because each of our efforts matter, that each of us put our efforts that our lives not be trivial, but that we be Jews.
Thank you very much. Thank you for getting me out of Africa. Do you know, I have an unusual job, and often from day to day or week to week, certainly from month to month, I don't know what country I'm going to be in. Every time I call my mother, her first question is, what country are you in right now? But the only thing I've known about my schedule for the year 2000, and I've known this for 13 months now, is that on May 30th, 2000, I had to be here standing in front of you. And so you've actually given me a bit of stability in my life, because even now for the rest of the year, I don't know where I'm going to be, but I know that right now I'm here. So thank you very much. It's actually been an interesting trip to get here, because 2 weeks ago, I was in Gondar in northwest Ethiopia, where I run a clinic for 9,000 people. I checked in, it was Friday morning, I checked into the airport to fly back to Addis Ababa because I have an Ethiopian family there that I spend Shabbat with. And I waited a few hours and found out that all the flights were canceled and that in fact the war had started with Eritrea. So my question then as a Jew is, how do I react to this? Do I stay in Gondar for Shabbat? Do I break the Shabbat, which I don't like to do, and drive to Addis Ababa? Do I just ignore the whole situation? Well, I thought for a moment, and I sort of argued it back and forth in my mind, and I decided that, well, you know, Rick, there's a war going on. It really is in your best interest to get to the capital city. So I did spend 17 hours driving on a dirt road for the next couple of days until I arrived in Addis Ababa. I got back to Addis Ababa, took a shower, and was relaxing. I sat down at my desk to try to figure out what I was going to say tonight. And the oldest of my household, who's an Ethiopian named Bayalin in his early 20s, came up to me and he said, "What are you working on?" He calls me Muse. Muse, what are you working on? And I said, you know, I have to give a talk on why be Jewish. And he turned to me and he asked me a remarkable question. He said, you know, there's something I always wanted to ask you. And I said, what's that? He said, why do you do what you do? Is it your religion or is it your nature? And I thought this was a great question, and it really made me start thinking about why I do what I do to the extent that I can understand it. You know, so the question tonight is, why be Jewish? And there's many opinions on this. Let me read you. Sigmund Freud told one of his colleagues at one of his Wednesday meetings in 1907 that the religion of Israel is a compulsive neurosis, which has been continued for hundreds of years. His colleague at the time in 1907, Carl Jung, in a conversation made a strong point that Jews were different from other people, and that they ought to be dressed up in different clothes because otherwise we mistook them for people like ourselves. In Africa right now, in 7 or 8 different African countries, there are pseudo-Jewish groups with people claiming to be Jews, people wanting to be Jews, people claiming to have been Jews in the past, people saying, well, maybe I didn't come from a Jewish background, but I'm Jewish now. And our grandparents wouldn't believe how popular it is to be Jewish in Africa. And so I mentioned this to a friend who's an Orthodox rabbi, and he started laughing. He said, it seems like everybody wants to be Jewish except for the Jews. Well, I grew up in Long Island from a very Reformed family. My first year of life, the Christmas of my first year of life, we had a Christmas tree. This was the only Christmas tree we had because my mother decided that it wasn't proper. But I asked my father recently why we had a Christmas tree, and he turned to me and, as if it was obvious, and he said, it was your first Christmas. My family joined a Reformed synagogue. And again, I asked my father, in preparation for this, why did you join a Reformed synagogue? And he said, your mother wanted to join a synagogue, and I didn't want to change my lifestyle. So we were members of a nice Reformed congregation. The attitudes that I got towards Judaism in my family is that it was a very nice civilization. It was important, but it was not important to be religious. And in fact, I never heard any criticism of Jews, but I felt the comments I would hear on my family is that it wasn't necessary to be religious. And it was even sometimes stupid. I mean, these are modern times. What do you mean people don't answer the phone or because it's Saturday? Or what do you mean people walk 3 miles to go to synagogue? Because it's not work to walk. It's not work to drive, but it is work to walk. We attended synagogue several times a year. On Friday nights, if we remembered, we lit candles. If we didn't remember, we didn't. But the idea of Shabbat, the idea of a day of rest or sort of a holy day, that was not part of my upbringing. I had a religious education in the local religious school and was bar mitzvahed there. My impression, say, for example, in high school of the synagogue that I grew up in, is that, first of all, I felt it was a bit boring. I didn't feel that there was a lot of people interested in real Judaism or in spirituality. I didn't feel like they were concerned with the suffering that I felt going on in the world. And this is, of course, the height of the Vietnam War, and I didn't see them being very upset about the Vietnam War. I had problems with them selling. I still have a problem with the idea of selling tickets to go to services on the holidays as if people are going to the movies. And at the same time, I was wondering how one could have a proper effect on the world. Well, I started going to Quaker meetings because with the Quakers, I found that these are people who really were concerned about world affairs. I found that they were willing to go to jail, they were willing to take risks in their lives, and I very much appreciated their style of worship, which is a quiet group meditation. And it took me many years before I realized that there's certainly a Jewish tradition of this as well. And in fact, in Judaism, we learned that not only for the soul, but the best thing it says in Pirkei Avot, for the body itself, is silence. I went to university, to medical school, did residency in Baltimore. I was largely unobservant during that period of time. I was also largely completely unaware of what it meant to be Jewish. I mean, I remember one year as an undergraduate, I wanted to keep Passover. So that year I did not eat bread for 7 days. And I thought I was doing the right thing. I mean, I still drank beer and I still ate cake and I still ate pasta. But I thought that I was doing the right thing because I just was unaware of this. And any learning which I had as a student had certainly gone over my head. Well, in 1985, I finished my residency in internal medicine in Baltimore. And then I wanted to go off and teach in Africa for a couple of years. So I got a Fulbright fellowship, and the Fulbright Commission asked me to go to Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And so I went to teach internal medicine and cardiology for a few years at the university there. There's nothing to do in Ethiopia. There's not much to do now, but there certainly wasn't anything there to do then, especially in the evenings. And so I would listen to the BBC, and I would sit at my desk and write my papers and listen to the BBC in the background. The BBC is a remarkable thing because every day they have a little religious program. And once or twice a week, they have a rabbi who gives a talk on the Parsha of the week or on some Jewish topic or on the most recent holiday or something like that. And I found myself, as an adult, learning things about Judaism that I had never known existed. I mean, for example, I remember the BBC rabbi talking about how Abraham had a vision of God while three travelers were passing. And he interrupted his vision of God to go and tend to the guests. And Rashi teaches us that tending to guests is more important than having a conversation with the Lord itself. I mean, this was something completely new to me. I didn't know this. Or I remember hearing, I was really taken, I remember, when he started talking about strangers and how Jewish people feel about strangers and how we were strangers in the land of Egypt. And, we're not commanded to love our mothers and our fathers, but we are commanded to love the stranger. And I was just remarkably struck when I heard about this. And so I sort of became curious about Judaism, and I thought, well, maybe there's some interesting stuff there that I just never knew about. So when I got back to America, I started picking up books and trying to learn something and spending time arguing with rabbis about all of this stuff. And I found myself more and more being convinced that maybe this is the truth. So I thought, well, maybe, but then I would see Orthodox Jews and I'd say to myself, do I want to be like that? And answered, I really had very mixed feelings about the process. And so I decided to start going in this direction and see what would happen. So the easiest mitzvah, religious commandment for me to observe was to throw away my razor and to get an electric shaver, because one of the commandments from the Bible is that you don't shave with a razor. So I was doing that, and I thought, well, this is very easy. And then, other things, tefillin, for example. And after some time, I decided I would try using tefillin. And I actually ran into a Chabad rabbi and asked him about tefillin, purchased some. And it was interesting because if somebody came to me and wanted to learn about tefillin, I would sit and I would talk and I would show him text and so on. This Chabad rabbi didn't do anything like that. He just said, put on tefillin and say the Shema, and that was it. He didn't teach me anything. And even I said, should I read something? Should I do anything? He said, no, just do it. So I put on tefillin every morning and said the Shema and took it off and went about my day. I mean, I ate whatever I want and didn't keep Shabbat or anything like that. The idea of Shabbat was really quite a challenge because I'm a bit hyperactive to begin with. And the idea that you should have one day when you don't do anything and you just rest, this was a very difficult concept for me. And I remember I decided one time to keep Shabbat, and I kept Shabbat as best I could, and I didn't write and I didn't turn on lights and things like this. And I found it tremendously difficult. And I consulted people who were religious, and I said, you weren't always religious, and now you keep the Sabbath. How is it for you? How was it? What kind of change was it? People all said the same thing. They said, once you start keeping the Sabbath, you ask yourself, how could I have never done this before? And so it did. So I eventually started keeping half a Sabbath and then 3/4 of a Sabbath. And then it just seemed like the natural thing to do is to keep the Sabbath. And I've done this for well over 10 years now. And now I consider myself, in the modern sense, an Orthodox Jew, which means I keep the Shabbat and I keep kashrut. And I try to behave myself as I think the Bible tells us to. So I made a list of why we should live by Jewish law, why I think this is the truth. And I think, in my opinion, it fulfills you as a person. It gives me personal satisfaction. I think it's consistent with 3,000 years of our history. And I think it's what God wants us to do. It's maintained our people in exile. And it's been the basis of our social justice. Now, there's a parsha in Deuteronomy, in Parshas Ekev, where God is telling us what he wants of us. He wants us to love him and to fear him and to walk in his way and to keep his commandments, which he commanded us today. And it says, "L'tov lach," for your good. And I've really come to the realization, I think, that these commandments are really for our good. And so I myself have no problem keeping them now. And I find that it's a great pleasure. There's a lot that I had to learn. I mean, for example, this idea of Shabbat and the laws of Shabbat, and even the beauty of Shabbat, I never experienced before. Kashrut, Shemitah, this idea of a sabbatical year. I didn't know anything about this stuff. I never had seen tefillin until I was in my 20s. This idea of Lashon Hara, that Jews don't gossip about each other, that to embarrass somebody is like murdering somebody. This was completely new to me. I didn't know what a mikveh was. I didn't know what the Amida was, the Shemona Esrei, which now I say 3 times a day. These days we're counting the Omer, and I had no idea. I had never heard of this before. I didn't know that Jews had 6 fast days a year, and I didn't know that Jews believe in reincarnation. Well, how does this affect my life now? Because I've been living for over a decade in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. I wake up in the morning in my house, my cottage in Addis Ababa, and I turn on the lights to see whether I have electricity that day. I turn on the water to see whether I have water that day. And I make sure the kids get off to school and the youngest one takes his medicine and the dogs are fed. Life in Ethiopia, everything is more difficult than here. There's no kosher meat to eat, so I don't eat meat. On Passover this year, there was no cooking gas in town. I mean, there was preparations for war, and there was no gas around. And I knew I needed to have gas to kosher my kitchen. If I couldn't kosher my kitchen, then Passover would have just been matzah and canned tuna for a week. And I sent my houseboy out, and he spent 2 days, and after 2 days, he called me, and he said, I found 1 cylinder of gas, which they're willing to sell you for $60. And I said, take it. And so that's what we used to kosher the kitchen. And then that's what I used also to boil the raisins so that I would have wine so I could say Kiddush, because we don't have kosher wine in Ethiopia. I spend my Shabbats in Ethiopia seeing patients. I have my clinic in Addis Ababa, which cares for 8,000 people. And then I'm also the doctor at Mother Teresa's Mission. So usually I go to both places on Saturday morning. And then by the end of the morning, I try to be home, and I try to be home all afternoon. And people know that I'm home, and friends stop over to see me, and I try to spend the afternoon relaxing, eating, sleeping, and studying the Parsha. I used to see people praying in airports with talit and tefillin, and I thought these people are mad. Now I'm actually one of them. And 2 weeks ago, as I was flying out of Ethiopia on the back of a Kenya Airways plane, I was sitting in the last row, and it was 7 o'clock in the morning. And I knew that if I didn't put on tefillin then, it would be very difficult to do it for the rest of the day. And so I put on my talit and my tefillin in this Kenya Airways plane. A few years ago, I spent a night sleeping on the concrete floor of one of the hangars in the Entebbe airport. I woke up the next morning and wanted to do the morning prayers there. You can imagine there's no minyan in Entebbe these days. And so I went into the hangar next to ours, which was filled with Russian MiG fighter planes, and I put on my talit and my tefillin. 30 meters away on the other side of the runway was the wreckage of the MiGs destroyed by the Israelis at their raid in Entebbe in 1976. And this is what I saw that morning. I remember having a conversation in Rwanda with a Muslim fellow. I was treating his son for cancer in this refugee camp in Kibumba. And his tumor had melted away with chemotherapy, and this guy thought I was the greatest doctor in the world. And I wanted him to know who I was, because he wore a kippah and I wore a kippah. And I said to him, why do you think I wear this thing on my head? He said, because you're a Muslim, like I am. And I said, no, as a matter of fact, I'm not a Muslim, I'm a Jew. And my translator said to me, Dr. Rick, there's no word for Jew in Kinyarwanda. So I said, well, how about the word Yehudi? So he said, the Mazungu, the white doctor, he's Yehudi. And this gentleman was struck, because whatever he thought about Jews is not what he thought about me. And he said to me, well, who are you people? He said, do you believe in Jesus? And I said, no, we don't. He said, do you believe in Muhammad? I said, no, we don't follow him. We only follow the Old Testament. We only follow Abraham. And he said, and do you pray 5 times a day like I do? And I said, no, but we pray 3 times a day. He said, well, 3 times a day, that's not bad. My vision of Judaism now, and we'll study this text later on, having a relationship with each other and having a relationship with the Almighty. And I think that what we read from Isaiah, the Haftorah from Yom Kippur morning, summarizes this very well. I think from my understanding, what God wants of us, he wants us to be very active in the world. He doesn't want us to only spend our time studying the Bible. On the other hand, he wants us to live a Jewish life. He wants us to have a relationship with him as well. recently, one of the things that I do in Ethiopia is I have a program to send Ethiopian kids to America for specialized care. And I have a 20-year-old university student who's going blind. He's been accepted for free surgery here, and I've been trying to find a family who would take him for 2 months. Well, I contacted some congregations and some rabbis. One rabbi emailed me back and he said, he's very sorry, but many of the people in his congregation keep kashrut, and they would feel uncomfortable having a non-Jewish person there because of their pots and pans. And I thought, well, what kind of priority is this? I mean, this kid is going blind, and Jews are worrying about their pots. To me, this was not the right way to do things. Although I have to say that this same rabbi was able to find another gentleman who is willing to take this person, and so the story actually does have a happy ending. I'm talking too much, so let me just close here. But I'd like to close with a story that happened to me in Tanzania. I was in Kigoma, Tanzania, which is all the way on the western side of the country. Refugees were coming across Lake Tanganyika from Zaire. And there was a cholera epidemic, and there was a war going on, and these people were really quite traumatized. I went there, I was working 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, treating malaria and treating cholera. And so several years ago, on the Shabbos of Hanukkah, I paused in my little doctor's room there to light Shabbos candles and Hanukkah candles. And so I said to my translator, tell the people they have to wait for a moment. And they were waiting, and I lit my candles. Well, one of the people turned and they said, what is he doing? And the translator said, it's the doctor's holiday today. I don't know what it is. So they asked one of the people, the refugees had a little discussion among themselves. And then they came over and they asked me a question. One of these young men said to me, what religion are you? And I said, I'm a Jew. And he said, what does it mean to be a Jew? I don't know this religion at all. What is the unique thing about your religion? What is the point of being a Jew? And again, it was one of these questions that I was really struck with. I looked around and I had about 25 people in the room. I had some Christians, I had some Muslims, I had some non-believers. I really wanted to answer the question, but I didn't want to talk about whether we're chosen or not, kashrut or Shabbat or tefillin or any of these things that are so important to me, but somehow I wanted to come up with an answer. And I thought for a moment, and I said to him, the Jewish people were asked by God to be examples to the world of three things: honesty, morality, and kindness. That's the point. And he said to me, what a great religion. Thank you very much.
I'd like to open up now the question and answer section. I would like to just to start off with a couple of questions, and then I'll take questions from the audience. First of all, for Rabbi Schonfeld. Now, I have to say I came up with some questions ahead of time, but in the course of their presentations, both speakers answered the questions, so I had to come up with some questions on the fly, so hopefully they'll be good. First of all, I think you were both wonderful speakers and very articulate and very moving, so I wanted to thank you for that. But Rabbi Schonfeld, when you were talking about your move from life in the theater to a Jewish life, I was struck by the fact that many people who become religious feel that some people who become religious feel that they have to throw away their old life or somehow reject their old life. And I correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm sure you will, but I got a little bit of a sense of that from your presentation, that in a sense you were turning your back on the theater. And I'm wondering how, now that you've gone the path, right, that you've been true to the path, the spiritual path that you were talking about, I'm wondering if you are now able to go back and reintegrate in yourself that other part of your past, namely the theater.
Well, I have pursued things in theater all these years. I did that show while I was in rabbinical school. I think that my answer to the question would be the following, if this answers your question. The primary difference that I see between theater as one's central pursuit, perhaps, and not only Judaism, but let's say also now at this time, the rabbinate as a central pursuit, is that it always seemed to me that when one is working on a play, right, the goal is to come up with the new interpretation, right? The goal is to sort of exceed the boundaries and do something different. Right? In many ways, part of the goal of Jewish life is to do that which has been done. Not to exceed the boundaries and change it every time, but to achieve some sort of continuous, consistent replication of this ritual, this thing, etc. What is, of course, hidden within it, and which Judaism very much accounts for in this notion of the Chiddush, right? The Chiddush is the sort of new insight, is what is also known to someone who is working on a play, whether performing it or even in terms of writing it, is that when you become truly familiar with something, comfortable with something, in the repetition of it, the very new is revealed, right? The very fresh is revealed. And it is that sort of new within the usual, right, that I think is part of what Judaism is trying to get at. And over time, in my Jewish practice, right, there has been sort of a merging, a coming together of a confidence in my judgment, right, about finding what is truly an appropriate and useful, fresh and new approach, and what are the things that are really beautiful left as they are.
Thank you very much. That's a great answer and a very thoughtful answer. Dr. Hodes, a question for you. I can't help but think, how hard it must be to be in Ethiopia and become religious, considering that there's no kosher meat, there's no kosher wine, there's very little of anything that we here in New York take for granted as things that help us live a Jewish life. And so I have a two-part question. First of all, you did mention it, so I don't know how much more you want to elaborate. A, what was it like becoming religious in Ethiopia? And B, what did you learn from the Ethiopian Jews, Jewishly?
Well, I started the path to religion in Ethiopia, but I was reading and I was starting to question, but then my learning actually took place in the United States and in Israel. So in that sense, it wasn't a problem, but I had spent several years ago, actually in the late 1980s, after my Fulbright ended, I spent some time in Washington, D.C., and then was working in a private practice and decided that I should spend a year in Israel. So I moved to Israel sometime in 1990, and then was spending some time there. And it was in Israel that I was able to sort of get a good impression of how I wanted to be and what it meant in my mind to keep the mitzvot. Now, then I went back to Ethiopia well before the year ended because I have I was uniquely qualified to work with Ethiopian Jews because I had been there for 2.5 years before. So I had maybe kept Shabbat for 2 months when I moved back to Ethiopia. And so knowing that the Ethiopian Jews keep Shabbat and being able to discuss with them and going to synagogue with them, that was a great experience because they would tell me about what Shabbat was like in their village, and I would tell them about what Shabbat is like in Jerusalem, which now they're hopefully experiencing. So we reinforced each other very well.
Thank you. It sounds like it was a fascinating experience. Now I'd like to, we have a few minutes for some questions and then we'll go right to our text. I'm happy to take questions for either speaker. Please raise your hand. Okay, this woman here. Let me just restate the question. This is for the doctor. You said you're a modern Orthodox Jew. What is your position on the rights of women in Orthodoxy?
Well, I try to maintain myself within Orthodoxy, but I'm probably on the liberal end. So I don't have any problem with women reading the Torah or putting on tefillin if that's what they choose to do.
Okay.
But I do try to stay inside the bounds of halacha. So that does put some limitations on things.
Okay, thank you. Another question?
When you were younger, growing up, I would say elementary school, middle school, high school, and your friends were Jewish also?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, were they more religious than you were?
I'm just going to restate all the questions so that everybody can hear them. Is that okay? For Rabbi Schonfeld, when you were growing up, were your in the various schools that you went to, were your friends more religious than you were?
Yes, I'm wondering if there's somewhere else you're going with the question. Yeah.
I just wanted to know why, when you decided that you wanted to live a more religious life, how come you did it then and you didn't do it back when you were younger? You feel the need when you were younger?
Did everybody hear it? Okay. The question is, why did you feel the need, I guess, at that particular point when you decided to live a more religious life, why did you do it then as opposed to previously?
Okay. So I think there's two answers. There's many answers, but two to your question. One is, of course, that I was young, right? That these are, and I was also living in my parents' household, and a part of that, a part of what was for our family a whole expression of ourselves and how we lived our lives. It was in my own adult life that I was then seeking other aspects of that expression. But there's another piece, which is that I grew up in New York. I went to New York City public schools. I discussed this experience of teaching in New York City public schools. And I was very much, and still am very much, acculturated to a celebration of difference, right? And to a celebration of sort of pursuit of knowledge and pursuit of depth through an experience of difference. So my experience when I was younger and even through college was much more about sort of seeing the breadth of other people's experiences, being with this Black American playwright, Latin American playwright, Asian American playwright, and sort of finding out what all of these things had in common, right? It was when I really saw that I didn't have something to put into that conversation that I had to move on.
Just
a brief follow-up. Did you find, or to what extent did you find the diversity of your original upbringing, I guess juxtaposed against the focus of your thoughts today, and how how did that help you? How did that hurt you? Could you expound on that just slightly?
I'm just going to restate it so everybody can hear it. To what extent did the diversity of your original upbringing help you or hurt you in where you are today?
Help me or hurt me in where I am today? Well, certainly I think that experience of difference, also in going through New York City public schools where really, Bronx Science is about celebrating people from these different backgrounds coming together to study together. My college experience was about that. I wouldn't say it hurt me, but I would say that there's a sense of struggle always against doing something where you are kind of always conforming to a norm, right? As I talked about in the theater, right? Where a lot of the emphasis is not on the celebration of doing something different, right? Or the celebration of, gosh, ain't it great that we're all different, but we're all the same, right? But the focus is on really kind of refining this specific practice, right? And spending a lot of time and energy, not just in kind of visiting all of these different paths and experiences, but really focusing on one. How it helped me is I hope that it makes me open-minded to people in wherever they may be coming from. I hope that it makes me a slightly better rabbi when people come to me and they're not doing things exactly as I think they ought to be doing them.
Let's take maybe somebody over here, this gentleman.
Yes, Dr. Hodes. Has being a Jew ever presented a problem for you in dealing in the third world, created barriers between what you want to do as a doctor and some of the political situations that you face there?
Let me just restate.
How have you handled them?
Has being a Jew created a problem in the third world places that the third world countries that you've been in, and has that interfered in your role as a doctor, and how have you handled it?
I spent a brief period of time in Somalia, and I didn't tell people I was a Jew. In Rwanda, in Zaire, in Tanzania, I wear a kippah all the time, and so people who know what a kippah is know that I'm a Jew. It's never been a problem, actually. There was one thing that happened when I was in Tanzania where the United Nations representative was a Muslim, and I didn't know how he would react to me. It turns out he had just an incredibly positive feeling about Jews, and he had done a master's thesis on Theodor Herzl, and he quoted Herzl to me. And actually, the reason for our success sort of in that little project had to do with his feelings towards me as a Jew and how that helped us deal with the United Nations system. So it hasn't been a problem.
You were very Herzl.
Right.
Let's maybe take maybe this woman back here. Oh.
Touchstones? Yeah.
And also I'm interested to know what you do in Israel, or if there's anything specifically you can sort of give to someone that is interested in pursuing from the very beginning, sort of a knowledge foundation.
A foundation or something that you can give for somebody who is starting on the path. Is that correct?
Thank you for mentioning touchstones, and I'll start there. What we do in this touchstones program is that people who come, who are beginning their path of studying Judaism, each do an individual project in, as Dr. Radensky described, the area of their passion. So someone who is a painter may pursue a Jewish question through painting, right? For example, someone recently did a small series of paintings where she compares the melodies that we do at each of the different times in Jewish prayer, holiday, Shabbat, regular time. Someone else who is an adoptive parent and likes to write wrote what's called a midrash. A midrash is an original interpretation about adoption. Someone who is here this evening is making a tallis. She is a costume designer. My suggestion is that you should go to that place where you most experience the transcendent. Everyone has gifts, right? God gives each of us gifts. And in whatever is that thing that you love to do, that absorbs your focus, where you really feel that moment that you are discovering things that you didn't know you know, go to that discipline and pursue some Jewish questions through it.
Maybe we'll take a couple more questions right here.
What was the reason, Doctor, that you chose to go to Africa? Was it because of your Jewish background? Did that have any influence, or was it just an individual choice?
Did your Jewish background influence you going to Africa, or was it individual choice?
No, I don't think it had to do with my Jewish background. I think I just wanted to teach in Africa, irrespective of that.
Okay, let's take a look. Maybe this person back here? How has Judaism been a sense of ordinary and extraordinary strength in what you've been doing?
I think I think prayer is a great tool. And I often, for patients who are open to it, I often try to pray with my patients. I pray for my patients without telling them that I'm praying for them quite often. But for example, when I was working in America, especially the African American patients, I think they're naturally spiritual and they like to pray. And often we would have a difficult situation and I would say, why don't we hold hands and pray together? And it's a very nice tool and people are often very open to it. And I think it's a very nice thing to do. So that's one example of sort of Judaism in practice in the world.
Very beautiful answer. I'd like to right now hold the questions and go to our text. And I would like to say also that both Rabbi Schonfeld and Dr. Hodes agreed to stay after the formal close of the program, and they'll come out here. And if you would like to meet them or speak with them afterwards, we can do that. But let's take a look at the text now. And please don't leave yet. We're almost done. Okay. And maybe I could ask Rabbi Schonfeld to open with some comments. We're going to be looking at page 743, Isaiah chapter 58, verses 10 through 14.
This is the Haftorah, the prophetic reading for Yom Kippur. And what is particularly interesting about this Haftorah, to both Dr. Hodes and to myself, is its combination of the ritual with the pursuit of the just. I find it very interesting, I will say, that this is what the rabbis chose as the prophetic reading for Yom Kippur, right? Our tradition, when we say the rabbis, I mean the sages, Chazal, they took a little piece of the prophets and they added it to every liturgical reading from the 5 books. And so I like to think that this reading, which we do on Yom Kippur, right, is the rabbi's way of saying to all rabbis forevermore, this is the sermon you should be giving, right? Don't choose your Yom Kippur sermon. This is what people need to hear on that day. And earlier in this Haftarah, it discusses the notion that you should not, I'm looking now at verse 3 for just a moment, right? Why, when we fasted, did you not see? When we starved our bodies, did you pay no heed? Because on your fast day, you did business and oppressed your laborers, because you fast in strife and contention, and yet strike with a wicked fist. Is this the fast I desire? And after the prophet has gone through quite a number of examples similar to this one, the prophet comes around to a notion of what I consider some sort of a Jewish definition of, if you will, what philosophers call the good life, right? That is to say that in the good life, your life will have such a meaning and a purpose beyond you that somehow you will be able to experience meaning not only in celebration, but also in struggle and also in suffering. And so I point that out in verse 10 and 11. And if you offer compassion to the hungry and satisfy the famished creature, then will your light shine in darkness, and your gloom shall be like noonday, right? And this notion, right, that somehow there is something, right, which pierces the darkness, which becomes available to us, not through our own pursuit necessarily of what we strongly desire, or through our pursuit of what society tells us we need, or how much we need, or what we have to have, but that somehow by our contribution to pursuing what is just, right, that sense of light piercing the darkness will be perceptible to us.
Dr. Hodes?
And then it continues, and immediately after it talks about you have to offer compassion to the hungry, you have to satisfy the famished creature, you have to bring the moaning poor into your homes, there are some of us who might sort of say, okay, that's enough. There are some of us who might say, well, I keep the Sabbath and that's all you need to do. But it goes on and it immediately talks about the importance of keeping the Sabbath. And so to me, this is our two relationships. It's our relationships with each other and our relationship with the Almighty. And God is saying to us that, don't forget either one. And I think for me, this is something which is very important.
Thank you. I'd like to just add, take advantage of my position as the moderator and just add a note, and then we'll close. With your permission. What Rabbi Schonfeld spoke about the verses, she spoke about in the verses, at least the allusion to Shabbat that Dr. Hodes spoke about, there's some space in between. And actually I wanted to look at that space in between, which to me is a very powerful passage. And that is that if you are compassionate, and I think also if you observe Shabbat as well, I think that's implicit here, you shall be like a watered garden, like a spring whose waters do not fail. And men from your midst shall rebuild ancient ruins, and so on. And the idea that by doing this, by being compassionate, and by observing the ritual to the best of our capabilities, we will be restored, and we will restore. We will bring back the greatness of our culture and also the greatness in ourselves, and we will be forever renewed. This is a beautiful text, which both Dr. Hodes and Rabbi Schonfeld suggested that we look at, and I think it's been very fruitful. And I think please take it home and study it. Let me now thank everybody for coming tonight. And I would like to thank especially our speakers, Rabbi Schonfeld and Dr. Hodes. Good night.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.